Okay, I think we'll give it a couple more seconds here, guys. And okay, well, we, on behalf of Duncan Finance Group and Bit by Bit, we welcome you to today's webinar relating to cyber events, cyber insurance, what companies can and should be doing to protect themselves. We have a lengthy agenda here today for you. So first, we want to meet with the gentlemen that are joining myself, David Lang, with this webinar are John Unse and Brett Creasy. I met these gentlemen actually working with our clients that had the misfortune of having cyber events. Some of them rather interesting. John is actually an attorney, so he tends to take point on a lot of the claim issues that we've seen our clients take, understands what you need to do to deal with and protect yourselves, but being the attorney, he also understands the law side of this equation and how it affects business owners and businesses when they do have events. Brett really has had to dig into some of our client systems to see exactly what occurred, how it occurred, who was affected, what do we need to do to fix the systems, what information was stolen, what information is available, do they have viable backups that we can recover from. It has been a whirlwind for some of my clients that Brett has had to deal with. So we're basically dealing with the CEO and president of Bit by Bit, who have, like I said, have unfortunately a lot of experience in this field and have had to help quite a number of our clients. Most of you on here already know myself, being the executive vice president of Duncan Financial Group. You know that my advising and I instruct for the Institute of Work Comp Professionals, being a degreed risk manager. I sit on the technical affairs committee for the independent agents and brokers, so I advise ISO insurance services offices as to coverages. I actually just came back last night from a national conference of insurance companies. And what we're talking about today is a significant issue that everybody is talking about with regards to cyber events. So a lot of business owners, when I meet with them, talk to them, they tend to bring up they think everything happens to the big companies. You know, it might be the Target credit card breach of Thanksgiving several years ago. It might be the Colonial Pipeline that was the most recent that you know, had a $3 million cyber ransomware demand. I even met the attorney that had to negotiate that. But unfortunately, that's not true. It is predominantly small businesses that tend to get affected. And a lot of times they target the small business because they have less protection, less in place, and it allows them to get into the larger businesses, much as what happened with the credit card breach with Target. It started with a HVAC contractor just outside of Pittsburgh. The office manager had a key logging virus that enabled them to get her user ID and password when she uploaded a work order to Target system. And once they were in Target system, you know, Target ended up with a multi-million-dollar loss. So it is something, this is a subject that pretty much every one of our clients is talking about. And just to understand, nobody, if you have a computer, you have a cyber risk. And unfortunately, a lot of businesses think, well, I'm not going to be the target. You know, I'm not the one that, you know, we got nothing to worry about. But in reality, if you have a computer, you have a cyber risk. There's a book called The Ostrich Paradox by Wharton professors Kunther and I'm drawing a blank on the other guy. Anyhow, long story short, it talks about why do people and businesses underprepare for disaster. You know, businesses tend to be optimistic. If you weren't optimistic, you wouldn't be in business to try to make money. A lot of businesses tend to be myopic in the sense that they look at short-term what they need to do. And a lot of times things like cyber might be viewed as a longer term project. And sometimes it's business owners business leaders make decisions by their gut. They don't have all the information, so they use their gut to fill in the void of data and make decisions based on that. And in essence, they're making decisions by, as the word professors call it, simplification. So ultimately, we have seen small employers, 2-3 employees, where they've had their payroll stolen. And $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 might not sound like a lot, but to somebody that's only got 2 or 3 employees, that's a lot of money. We've had them stolen up to $140,000 of payroll. We've had clients that have had money stolen out of their bank accounts because they got their user ID and password and transfer money out of their accounts. We've had an employer that had 80 employees at a $2 million ransom demand. So it doesn't matter who you are, what size you are. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. I equate it to, if you think 25, 30 years ago, if you were in business, did you buy employment practices liability insurance? Most of our businesses back then said, it's never happened to me, it won't happen to me. But yet when it did, or when it happened to somebody that they knew, which is what the word professors call hurting, that's when they went out and bought employment practices insurance. We're kind of in the same mode today, where a lot of business owners think, like I said, nothing happened to me, never happened to me in the past. But at some point it may happen to them or somebody nearby, and you will need to deal with cyber insurance. And to give you some sort of perspective before I let the guys dig into some of the statistics, in the insurance industry, the reason why it was such a big topic of discussion is insurance companies are taking significant rate increases on this coverage. They are reducing coverages on this. So when you see both an increase in rate and a decrease in what coverages they're offering, that tells you the insurance industry is not responding or can't respond quick enough to the growth in the number of claims that are occurring. So it is quite significant. And with that, I'm going to let Brett and John kind of dig into their world of cybersecurity.
Great, thanks, David. So Brett Creasy here, President and Director of Forensics, David mentioned. So what is cybersecurity? We kind of have a first question for everyone, and it unfortunately gets muddled a bit, I think, and means different things to different people. But at the end of the day, it's really 3 core components, I think. It's number one, the people, which is a piece that gets skipped a lot when people start thinking about cybersecurity. They think of just, antivirus and firewalls and things of that nature, technical things. But people are the number one piece in any sort of cybersecurity practice or defense. You can't do anything without the right folks in place. We encounter a lot of businesses that spend a lot of money on technology, on all the new fancy tools, but then they don't have the people that they need to manage and maintain them. We've got networks that are effectively unprotected because there's nobody watching. So people are the number one item. Technology, I would say, is number 2. So you do need the right tools in place. The firewalls, the antivirus. I'm making sort of generalities there. We'll get into some details later, but technology is a huge piece of any cybersecurity practice, of course. Excuse me. And then the third being processes. So, all the right people and all the right tools don't help if we don't have plans in place and the right processes in place. So digging in a little bit into the common attacks, ways that bad actors are getting in, what kind of those approaches are. David might have hinted at this earlier. It's not just a big business problem, it also affects small businesses. But the number one way that bad actors are, in fact, attacking both individuals and businesses is through credential theft, social engineering. I'm sure everybody on the call today has probably heard of phishing attacks and all the variations that they may take. I think maybe from a bad actor standpoint, if it's not broke, don't fix it on their end. And those types of credential type attacks still work. Still almost 2/3 of the reported breaches start because of an attack essentially against a person and tricking them. So that's still the number one area. The second being, and all of this is in the news quite a bit as well. Some of the incidents that David mentioned earlier, ransomware being a hot topic. And I think we'll touch on the impacts that can have on the business later today. But at the end of the day, if you get that initial click of the wrong link, the wrong document, or you have a server that is vulnerable to an attack, ransomware is often shortly behind in that chain. So when we talk about those attacks, I think it's important to remember that it's not just a technology problem. A lot of folks, I think, will see all of these things, a bad actor getting into an email system, for example, or a bad actor deploying ransomware within a business, or whatever it may be, as being a problem of IT. And certainly IT is the front lines in that, I guess, in some respects, but it really is an issue that affects everybody in the organization. It's in the news because it has real impact on everyone's lives. David mentioned the Colonial Pipeline. Okay, so there was a multi-million-dollar ransom demand. Well, that's not just a bottom line business problem, right? It affected millions of people who had nothing to do with Colonial Pipeline in their real world, efforts of trying to get gas. So it's a big problem. And those attacks, ransomware being a key one, can bring a whole business down. David, I don't know if you wanted to touch on, as we talk about, ransomware and the dollar figures there, but as we chatted earlier, you had some insights there, I think that were pretty interesting.
Yeah, excellent points you've been making. The looking at it, as I was mentioning, how insurance companies are raising rates and reducing coverage. The other things that they're doing is they're ratcheting up their requirements. And I know as we're going to be discussing further that the things that employers should focus on to keep themselves, try to prevent these incidents. But one of the components is they want to know how you're training your employees to identify and prevent. They're even going so far to ask if you're doing your own internal phishing exams, and that's PH, not FISH, in terms to try to figure out, are your employees getting duped by, even your own attempts to see if they are doing things that they shouldn't. We've had quite a number where these ransom demands, the breach of information, have all started by employees clicking on things that they shouldn't have, opening emails, opening attachments that have macros or things like that automatically get activated and download the virus into their system. So training of employees is critical. But yeah, and is everybody's seeing it's in the news more and more and more over the last couple of years, and it is accelerating exponentially. If you look at some of the statistics from the FBI, it's like more than, I think, 50-fold this year versus last year, the number of incidences that have occurred. But, and how should I pay this? I also think that with a lot of workers working remote during this pandemic, I think people were working from their home computers potentially, and that's allowed, if they remote in, if they are working at home, they may be a little bit more lax. If they don't have the proper controls when they remote in, if you can remote in, somebody else can remote in if you don't have the proper protocols in place to prevent that. So the pandemic has certainly escalated this. I think it's played a role in it, but it's growing regardless of whether the pandemic or not is occurring.
I think a key piece here that we saw, David, is, a core function of phishing attacks is, basically attacking people's fears, right? And so the pandemic played into that very well for a lot of those attacks. I think that's why, we saw that, multi-1,000% increase last year. Is you start sending out information with, sensational headlines, and it's easy to get somebody to click on something, go read a story.
Yeah. And just so you understand, it's not the poorly worded, South African prince that has $3 million that they want to bring to the United States. That's poorly written and with multiple grammar errors. They're employing, sophisticated marketing models, just like a marketing company would in terms of building emails. They are well written. They're using programs like Grammarly to make sure their punctuation and flow is correct. I mean, there's a lot of things out there so that they look legitimate and they sound legitimate. But as we did on one of our phishing expeditions for our own employees, we simulated a fake email from a legitimate source internally just to see, what percentage of employees would catch it. Because, if it's third party or outside, it's got a flag on it. But if it's internal, we still want to make sure our employees are doing what they're supposed to do to make sure that wasn't so in essence, if somebody's email had been able to get cloned or hacked, they would have thought it was a legitimate internal email. But and fortunately, our employees passed, so that was good. But that goes to the training aspect. So which I think is some of the things that we will dig into.
David, one other thing I did want to touch on, so that we don't totally ignore it, that was on the last slide, is about the changes that we're seeing in the landscape a bit. Really two things there come to mind. One being that, personal information is getting exposed and causing issues for companies more and more, I think is a trend that we're seeing. So, ransomware may be the big dollar thing, and certainly, carrying its weight. But personal information getting exposed is catching up, we'll call it, I guess.
Yep.
So that's where we start dealing with, 50 different state laws and other, legal requirements that exist for notification purposes, paying for credit monitoring, all of that. But I think, as more and more states, ratchet down on that sort of thing, from a consumer protection standpoint, we're going to see just a continued increase in that. And so, we've encountered issues where we've responded to an incident for a company. We've confirmed that, in fact, the bad actor got in and got access to information that they shouldn't have, and it was legally protected information, therefore triggering an actual breach notification. That client who was breached then had the challenge of identifying exactly who and where right, at an individual level. So when we asked them about, where, because they weren't a national company, and so the thought process there being, where are most of their clients? They believe most of their clients to be in a fairly limited regional area. And it turns out they had data that may not have fit the criteria of their client, but they were still in possession of it, and the bad actor still was able to access it. That meant that they didn't deal with just 5 states. They actually ended up dealing with high 40s. I forget what the exact number was, but most of the states in the country. And so that, as you might imagine, really increased the complexity of what they had to do.
Yeah, we have to comply with the state of New York. And if we would have a breach, the notification requirements like 24 hours or 48 hours, we have to be being able to mail out to everybody that's identified as potentially, had their personal identifiable information breached. And just understand that that cost adds up, because you got the cyber forensics bill that to pay you guys to figure out who and what was taken. And then it's, anywhere from $300 to $350 per person or business for offering credit monitoring services, the notification requirements. It's going to vary from state to state, like you allude to, and that is significant. And as we go through this process of our webinars talking about insurance, that's going to eat up significant limit, but that's actually not even what we're seeing the big dollar spent on, as we'll go through later on.
David, one other comment there to the resources that need to be committed to this kind of project. So you have the initial investigation to figure out how the bad guy or girl got in and stop it. And the second piece, in addition to breach notification, is all the time spent with technology and attorneys and technical experts tying, to Brett's earlier point, all the custodial data and the company's network with all the personal information that was accessed. So that's a sort of a third track that companies have to get their hands around before they can even go and give the notification. Because a lot of states require you to tell custodian A, B, or C what was accessed or believed to be accessed. So ferreting out that data in a large data set, or even a small data set, frankly, can take a lot of time and resources. There's technology that can be leveraged for that. And there are people, of course, that can help with that, as far as outside lawyers and firms like ours, but it's not a quick process and not an easy process. Often it's very complex. Just want to add that to the third leg of the resources that would be required to properly respond.
Yeah, and that's also thinking about that notification requirement, thinking about the information that takes time. So when you have an event, you have to move with lightning speed to start the process to figure out who and what happened, as we're just talking about. And that's not cheap. I have yet to see from any provider cyber forensics bill less than $40,000. I've seen several that have been in the hundreds. So, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of people to analyze what was taken. So, anything else, guys, or should we?
Yeah, the only last one I was going to mention, David, is kind of the increase in seeing attacks against, I'll call it web applications, so online resources. I think, a lot of businesses today are moving things to the cloud, right? This big white puffy thing in the sky. The most basic example being Microsoft 365 for email services and OneDrive and that sort of thing. So they might not have on-premise servers for a lot of things these days. And all that really means is the bad actors are following suit. So there's an increase, of course, of seeing those types of attacks on our end. So that's in terms of landscape change over the past few years. As businesses move to the cloud, so are the bad actors and the attacks that follow.
Yes, and since we're transitioning to their data and where they have their company resources, something that comes to my mind is the fact that just because you have some third party or you put it into the cloud yourself doesn't mean that you don't have exposure. We have seen those breached. And if you actually look at the contracts you sign, a lot of the ones that our clients have shared with us, if the cause of the breach was caused by one of your employees, not only are you responsible to pay to fix your own system in their cloud, you're also responsible for any other damages that may occur to anybody else's platform that may also be on that cloud platform. And it gets, so you have to, just because somebody else is hosting it does not mean it's somebody else's problem. And as we will talk about in the insurance side, you're now talking third-party platforms versus having coverage for first party, your own servers. We have to address the coverage later on that make sure that these cloud resources are protected. But yeah, it's and just thinking about it, if that leaks out, we had one client that had 250 gigabytes of data stored, and it unfortunately was customer proprietary information, not sensitive, personal identifiable, but that took a big hit on their reputation and they lost some customers over that. So that's some of the things you have to look at when it comes to what's at stake when you have an event. We had a client that, they're a wholesale retailer. On the web, their entire distribution system was housed by a third party that controlled, where their inventory, their purchasing and everything like that. And when they went down for almost 5 weeks from a ransom attack and rebuilding the system and not having very good backups because most of them got corrupted, they had a little bit over, they averaged about a little over 2 million a month in revenue. They lost a little over $2 million of revenue. And, that not only affected the profitability, by maybe, $300,000 to $500,000 from a profit margin. Those customers that couldn't buy started buying somewhere else, and they've noticed a reduction in revenue following that, because people are creatures of habit. If they can find it somewhere else, they start buying somewhere else. They start shopping somewhere. They start eating somewhere else, wherever. And that's why you have to make sure your systems are protected and able to get back up and running quickly. And just because this was a cloud-based, they lost their cloud-based service. So, and then ultimately, they had to notify some of their clients that, their bank accounts or credit card account were, released, and then they're getting fined from the credit card vendors, and things like that. There's a lot to this.
Touch on that for a second, if I may, David. So in terms of the legal liability section, it sort of crosses over into data privacy laws as well. And in the US, we're sort of catching up to Europe, sort of piecemeal. If there are any attorneys on the phone or security professionals with the GDPR regulations in the EU, the US hasn't, of course, adopted a federal standard yet for those sorts of topics, but California led the way, as it often does with laws. The CCPA a few years ago and the CPRA coming out in 2023. States like Virginia and Ohio and others are following suit. And the important there from a legal liability standpoint is if you're proactive in how you prepare for a cyber event. States, for example, in California, they actually call out frameworks that you should be looking at in order to meet your obligations. Again, it's not a 100% safe harbor necessarily, but it's a mitigation measure that could reduce or mitigate liability. Ohio has a pending law that the current language suggests that if you follow certain frameworks and have a breach, because none of these things are foolproof, of course, but if you follow certain frameworks and there's a breach, it at least shields the company from civil liability from the consumers affected or the customers affected. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't, of course, eliminate the cost of responding to the cyber attack or giving notification to folks whose PII was compromised, but it could shield you from a liability from a civil lawsuit perspective. So certainly liability can follow if you aren't careful. States are starting to think about, if you're more proactive, how you can help mitigate that loss. And so that's where it's really important. We don't give legal advice as a firm, but we often bring in law firms to help clients who want to think through those things to plan appropriately. This is not just an IT problem anymore. The person who handles your email box, for example, it does go to the general counsel's office, HR, security, and other functions too. So we want to just touch on that. It's a matrix problem, but there's also matrix solutions you can implement.
Yeah, and talking about solutions, we should probably move on to, now that everybody's going, holy smokes, this is what we're facing. Let's maybe give them some guidance as to, what they should be doing to try to protect themselves, guys.
Yeah, I think on that front, David, the number one item, whether it's the number one of these five or it's the thing that govern the five, is having a plan in place. So that's not just a actual incident response plan, which is important, which is, really your playbook, so to speak, on, if this happens, then do what, right? We need contact information and phone numbers and email addresses. And if that person doesn't pick up, who do I call next? That's an important piece of it, the incident response plan. But it's really, to John's point, I think the security frameworks being sort of the guideposts of what an organization is going to do from a cybersecurity standpoint. I think a lot of businesses struggle, both small and large, with, okay, what do we do next, right? Or if they're very green, I'll call it, they might be saying, where do we start? Even if they have a fairly sophisticated IT team, they might have a bunch of good things in place, but then they sort of hit a plateau and they say, okay, where do we go from here? The security frameworks that John mentioned is a great place to start. And so one that we work with often is called the Center for Internet Security, or CIS. Basically, it's a little tricky. It used to be called the SANS Top 20, and so people thought it was 20 controls, but it's really 20 groups of controls. So there's a lot of very tactical things within there. But the nice part about it is it's manageable for a business of any size to start down the right path. And so, you have to, of course, know yourself a bit and evaluate your business, but it'll cover things like, and to get to what's maybe the number one thing that an organization of any size can start with for protecting themselves, would be multi-factor authentication. So MFA, I would say, is probably the number one item. David, I'm sure you can touch on how insurance is pounded on that these days as well. But from our perspective, living in the response world most often, literally every email compromise that we've dealt with could have been stopped if the organization had MFA in place. And often, that technology is something that the organization actually already has a license for. The most common scenario we see is Microsoft 365 services. MFA is baked into the platform. And I don't think, maybe in the most basic licenses that you can buy from Microsoft, it might not be included, but pretty much any business plan is going to have MFA included as part of that licensing. It's just a matter of implementing it, right? Of turning things on, and yes, it might be a little annoying to get things set up to begin with, but it can shut down literally the number one most common data breach in the world. It's probably a good step to take, and so I would beat that drum a little bit as the number one item.
Yeah, I'm going to beat on that drum a little bit more. It is a requirement for the cyber insurance policies nowadays. It's some of them even have you sign attestations. That's questions you got to sign. But if you think about it, how many times we've seen somebody that had their email hacked, and you get these weird emails. And if you had multi-factor, you wouldn't get those. But number two, they're not just getting and sending out weird emails and hoping you click on a link. They're sitting there lying and waiting, and they're waiting to pounce to see where they can make money. They're going in and seeing when you send out PDFs of your invoices and then attaching, recalling messages and attaching saying, hey, we're no longer taking checks. Please pay us by ACH or EFT, whatever. And here's instructions. And you don't know what's going on because they cloned your account and cleaned their trail. If you go to the server, they can retrieve everything that they did. like you were telling me earlier, Brett, but it's just mind boggling. We've had clients that have had their clients pay somebody else because somebody intercepted their email. And it's one of the things that we implemented a long time ago. You know, it's you don't have to keep doing it when it's on your main computer. You don't have to keep doing, you know, for your emails on your phone. It's when it recognizes, what is it? What did you say? Was it the MAC address or something? Whatever.
Yeah.
It registers it. But long story short, you only have to do it once. And it's only when a new computer tries to register that email that or log into it that it requires the multi-factor. So like you're saying, it only affects you once and it's not that hard after you implement it.
Yeah.
So
I think it is, and it is typically tied to a device, to your point. And really what it's shutting down is, you know, all of these, we'll pick on email service because it's the number one thing, but you know, the bad actors are logging into the website for Microsoft 365, right? And so anytime you log into the website, it's going to require that MFA. And there's all sorts of other very technical things we could get into about conditional access and things. And, you know, the system can, you know, tell if you're logging in from an IP address, you know, in the US or not, or if you were logged in Pennsylvania and then 30 minutes later you logged into California, that's an impossible travel route. So it would block, you know, that second login from California. There's all the fancy things, but at the most basic level, it's really just getting that initial setup so that when you log in, the system recognizes that you're coming from a trusted device. And if not, then your phone, you're either going to get a text message or maybe you'll have a little app on your phone that's going to have a little extra security code that you're going to have to punch in. And so, you know, a couple seconds of inconvenience can, you know, really stave off multi-million-dollar losses for the company. So I guess moving on then perhaps to item number 2, I think we touched on this in a couple of different ways earlier, is security awareness training. It's not so much a technical control, but going back to the people part that I mentioned at the very beginning, you know, having a baseline of knowledge of what information security is and what's expected of every employee is critically important, because, you know, so many attacks start with that social engineering style attack of people, and gaining their trust or preying on their fears. You know, getting that training in place is critically important. And I would also point out that that doesn't mean training people about information security on their onboarding process and that's it, or, you know, having them sit through a PowerPoint presentation maybe once a year that they're halfway paying attention to, and then that's their training. It really needs to be continual. You know, David, to your point of, you know, testing your people in-house, you know, phishing yourself, et cetera. That's something that, you know, we do for our clients as a service. But it's critically important because you're right. If a bad actor does get in and then they can, you know, pretend to be somebody that is trusted on the inside, you still want your people reacting in the same way, in the right way. You know, when the boss asks for, you know, a sudden change in process, for money to be sent someplace else, for somebody to go, you know, buying gift cards is always a common one. You still want people to have been exposed to that and trained and, you know, not forgotten about their training, right? If you only did it 9 months ago, they may have forgotten all those little tricks and concepts and things. And so that continual training and tying it to their job in some manner is critically important. You know, I've seen businesses implement sort of reward type programs for that. So if people are, you know, reporting suspect events and phishing attacks and things like that, there's some sort of monetization. Maybe it's, you know, I don't know, gift cards and mugs and things like that, but they get some sort of recognition to really keep an eye on.
Sort of like whenever in our safety side, if somebody sees a unsafe environment or something like that, or somebody doing something unsafe and they bring it up, they get a little bit of a reward on the work comp side, you're doing the same thing from a cyber. That's a pretty good idea.
So moving on, kind of give us a couple more topics to shoot at here that are tangible, I think. I would say asset management is on the list. So that's really, I think I might have mentioned this earlier. You have to know yourself before your enemy does. And it seems like such a basic concept, but I would say probably over half of the companies that we get engaged by don't have a clear list of what their assets are. And that may be a physical thing like a server sitting in a closet someplace to sort of the intangible data type that might be moving about between different systems, but that is at the end of the day often the keys to the kingdom. And so you've got to know what you have and where you have it so that you can protect it appropriately. If you don't, how can you possibly be expected to protect it?
And Brad, if I could jump in there just 1 second on what you're calling, I think, data mapping. From a legal perspective, that exercise is really critical. Forget about cyber for a minute, even though we're talking about cyber here. But the other dual benefit would be if you're a company involved in an investigation, a subpoena, some kind of dispute, third party, just whatever it might be, where data needs to be retrieved, harvested, and analyzed. Having that map for that purpose too is incredibly important from a law perspective. You see many clients not know where the data is and then can't find it or lost it. And then there are adverse consequences before civil and federal courts and state courts, rather, if you don't have the data when you should have it. So there's multiple reasons why this is a good idea. Cyber is certainly a key one of them, but from a legal liability standpoint, we think it's really important to have that data map. It takes time and effort. It's not easy, but it really pays off and mitigates risk for both sides here.
Yep. And just a transition, maybe one at least starting point for that for a lot of folks that we found helpful is I'll put number 4 on the list as being patching or vulnerability management. So most people have probably heard of the concept, at least, of servers being vulnerable to certain attacks, and that's because of some flaw in either the software or the configuration of that system. And so there's a whole life cycle of, just like you have maintenance on a car, patching your servers and the software and other tools that you have. And so in the grand scheme of things, those types of attacks aren't as prevalent as social engineering and phishing type attacks, but it's the low-hanging fruit, I like to think of it. It's the easy stuff for the bad actors to attack. So I think, sufficiently made the news recently in the past year anyways, of some of the attacks on Microsoft Exchange servers for businesses who had that on-premise. So not in the cloud, not Microsoft 365, but ones that still have email servers, behind their 4 walls. There were some vulnerabilities there that, bad actors made use of. Microsoft and others came out and rang the alarm bells and told people what to do about it. But months and months and months later, even after all of that, we were still seeing and responding to businesses who, didn't properly heed those warnings. They tried maybe a little bit, but not completely, or what have you, and they fell victim to that. And so those 2 items there kind of really dovetailed together. Knowing what you have and then dealing with the patching and the vulnerabilities associated with that. One way that might be addressed that we see is doing what's considered a vulnerability scan. So it's actually a specialized computer that's set up to probe the other computers on the network for vulnerabilities. And of course, there are tens of thousands of known vulnerabilities at this point, but that sort of scanning can be set up to run almost continuously in a very automated fashion. And so the dual benefit of that is, it is checking to see what systems are, I like to call it, on the wire. So, what is on the network. And that gives you a starting point for some of that asset management, perhaps, because if something is on and able to be communicated with by other systems, then at least you're not going to have some server, sitting off on the side there that somebody has forgotten about with a bunch of vulnerabilities that the bad actor is going to use to break into your network and wreak greater havoc. So the vulnerability management, I would say, is probably number 4 in our list of things to start with. And before we, I guess, maybe shifting to the last one, David, I know we had a long conversation about this previously, but backups. It's not necessarily a preventative step that companies can do, but it is a critical step in mitigating many attacks, certainly ransomware attacks. The MO of bad actors today is not to just, dump ransomware on a system and let it go encrypt all the documents and they're going to sit back and hope for payment, right? They're actively seeking out your backups if you have them and trying to destroy them. And so you really have to think about the strategies around backups, whether that's going to be something on premise on a different server, and if so, how is it being protected from, say, unauthorized access or deletion or ransomware, even encrypting the backups, or cloud-based backups? And what do you need to do to protect that? That circles us back around to perhaps MFA. And so there's a lot of things to be considered there, but having backups is a key component, I think, in the overall process there.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, just so that everybody's aware, when it comes to some of these ransom attacks where they tend, at least in my experience, lie in wait and actually start damaging your backups, so that we had an insurance company that lost over 2 months worth of data. We had to resend, copies of policies, send change requests, because even though they were cloud-based backups, they lost their data was corrupted, and the newest or the most recent uncorrupted backup was like 2.5 months prior. They lost 3 or 4 months worth of emails. So you have to pay attention to, as you're backing it up, and like you said, multi-factor. That's something that they ask for with the insurance companies. Do you require multi-factor to get into your email, your backup systems? Multi-factor for remote access, so your multi-factor is on point. Your plan, it's much like building a disaster plan. If you're preparing to, what happens if my place burns down, where do I get my machinery, or where do I get my equipment, where do I order my supplies, where do I have, it's basically doing that for the computer system. So that's a lot of good stuff there. So yeah, and I know you do it, but I know there's a lot of firms that have helped some of our clients like yourselves develop these plans, put them in place, make sure that you have everything done. It's even the insurance companies, our insurance companies, some of them do vulnerability scans to even insure you, which is kind of interesting nowadays. The questionnaire, even to go through to, even if you qualify for insurance, can tell you some of the things you need to be doing. If you can't answer yes, sometimes A, you're not going to get insured, or B, you're going to pay a lot more money, but it's something that you probably should be doing. But yeah, I know, and I can't remember which one of you took care of this, but some of the plugging the vulnerabilities, your physical side. I think one of you told me a story about how they had employees were stealing or embezzling data or somebody stole data by just plugging in a USB port into a computer. And that's why you should turn off USB access to computers, and from a physical side. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done, but the steps you outlined do address the bulk of where we're seeing claims. Payroll stolen. Like I said, we've had over a dozen clients have payroll stolen. If they had multi-factor in the login for their payroll system, they wouldn't have been able to get in and change the employee's bank account information. So there's a lot to that.
Yeah, I think on the USB aspect or physical aspect there, David, is what makes the news, of course, is these nation state. Everybody thinks Russia and China is doing it all, but at the end of the day, yes, most attacks are outsiders, but it's in the 60th percentile, I forget the exact number, is actually organized crime. So it's easy to forget or not recognize that all of these attacks that we're talking about, it's a business model for many people. It's a successful business model. But to your point about the USBs and things, it's not all external hackers. It's not all organized crime. It's not all nation state. There's also the insiders. It makes up about a quarter of attacks is some sort of insider threat. So, people stealing data via, whatever means, USBs, cloud storage, personal accounts, et cetera. So it isn't just an outside in type thing.
Yeah, I know. I remember you actually helping one of our clients go through and do an investigation as to who was embezzling from them and how they were doing it. And eventually, with the information you gathered, we're able to identify who it was and hold them. They were able to hold them accountable. So yeah, and just because you delete a file doesn't mean it's deleted. There's always breadcrumbs. So
usually, yeah.
So, but hey, I'm going to put you on the spot here, guys. That's a lot of good information with the people attending, and when we post the link for the video, I'm going to put you on the spot. Would you guys give them a little list, a checklist of those top things that they can do that we can send out to everybody so that they can?
Absolutely, yeah. We can put together that, and maybe just short little resources that people can take a peek at. Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, and John Michael, I have not been able to see the chat window this entire presentation. I was just seeing if there's any questions in the chat.
Yeah, let me take a look here, David. Don't believe we have any right now, but it is open. So if anybody on the call does have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A and we will get those addressed.
So in their last wrap up minutes, while we're seeing if anybody types a question into the chat thing there, anything, oh, there we go. Okay. Are company cell phones a concern with security?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. I would say one thing that a lot of businesses will utilize to try to address some of those concerns is something called mobile device management, or MDM. Microsoft has some of that built into their 365 platform. So if you're a Microsoft user, you may have that available to you. There are third-party providers as well, but it's basically an app that allows you to lock down and control some of the security on mobile devices. So requiring the length and complexity of the password, encrypting it, blocking backups, perhaps, if you want to do that. There are all sorts of controls there that can be put in place for the mobile devices.
Yeah, I mean, just the simple process of making sure that there's either a biometric or more than a 2 or 3 digit passcode that you got to get into it would be beneficial.
There are ways, Brett, right, to whitelist or blacklist certain apps. So if there's a company issue mobile device, company gives you an iPhone, they don't want you having TikTok on your iPhone, that can be blocked. So there are ways in which you can sort of limit, again, not eliminate, but limit the risk of sort of social media or other apps where information is exchanged.
Yeah, and along those lines, that would also include your iPads, your laptops.
Yes. Yep.
I mean, even I can get around a Windows login screen. It's not that difficult. So, there's oftentimes people laptops, they set them aside and walk away from them to go get a cup of coffee or something, and they come back and they're stolen. Having what we call, I guess is what do you call it, boot level encryption or something like that, where they have to actually put a password in to even boot the computer, helps protect any information that might be on that laptop or on that phone.
Yep. Encryption is key there. The iPhones have that level of encryption baked in. And a lot of laptops are starting to come with it ready to go, we'll call it.
So but yeah, it's
There's another question in the chat as well, David.
Yep,
before we
I
move
saw
on.
that. Yeah, who would be the best to review a client's IT contract? Yeah, from my perspective, I always look at things from a risk transfer standpoint. Who's responsible when something goes bad? That's usually where I start when I read a contract. And a lot of times they're not as favorable to the, let's say, our client as the client might think. But I mean, certainly we've reviewed quite a number, but we're not attorneys. I know, John, you probably get into that kind of stuff being an attorney. I know you've had to review some of them when we've had some claims to see if the insurance company would have the means to subrogate back against the IT firm that maybe wasn't doing everything they should have.
Yeah, we assist with those things for sure, David. So we don't give legal advice officially to clients, although I'm a lawyer, have an active license. We have outside counsel typically do that, but we still assist behind the scenes with those sorts of analysis. And then if part of that question, embedded in that question is the contract sort of buttoned up from a technical perspective? Does it have the right controls and the right measures in it? Is it forward thinking enough? That's something someone like Brett and his team with a forensic background, security background could help assess as well.
But ultimately, when the key is, as we go through this, is the next session is going to be walking through what happens when you actually have a cyber event, a cyber breach, that ransomware attack, what you're going to need, what to expect to have to do, because you've never been through it before. So it's going to be very new ground for anybody. And I think that's going to be an important part of that. And, you know, understanding the insurance policies. And one of the things, just so you understand, one of the first things you need to do if you have a cyber insurance is file your claim, because the insurance company, depending upon, and we'll go through this in part 3, in part 2, they may mandate certain things that you have to do to even have the coverage or them agree to pay for stuff. So this is not as easy as everybody thinks. It's not like, and I will tell you this, some of as a little drip and drab when it comes to when you have a claim, what going through it and what you have to look at from your cyber insurance standpoint, every insurance policy has the duties of the insured in it. And let's say you have a property claim, you got a water pipe that breaks. The duty under the insured is to mitigate the loss. So you're going to turn off the water. You're going to try and, you know, clean up as much of it as you can. If you got wet stuff, you're going to try to dry it, you know, cut the bottom of the drywall off if it got wet, you know, try to air things out. And then you can turn in the claim as quickly as possible. In the cyber world, some of them run counterintuitive. You're going to want to, you know, get your system back up and running. You're going to want to try to get your computer system, you know, so you can conduct business. But the insurance company might say, well, wait a minute, you know, we're not going to pay the ransom unless we agree to it, or we're not going to pay to restore your system unless we agree to it. So it runs counterintuitive. You actually may have to get their blessing to wipe your nose when it comes to cyber insurance, or it may be broad enough that says you can do certain things as long as you notify us within a certain time frame. So that's some of the things to expect when you do have the cyber event that we'll talk about, and also what you look for from an insurance standpoint. But I don't see any more questions popping up here. But yeah, if you can give us that list of things that they should do, I'm certain that would, and maybe even some things that, although you're not going to leave, some things that they might want to think about when they read their contract. That would be great for our listeners today to be able to use as a resource. And then I would also suggest you include your some contact information if they have some additional questions. Now, yeah, we have this all on the screen. When we post and email out the link, we'll have everybody's contact information with it. But yeah, I think that's a lot of information we went over for a very complex and broad scope of what we're seeing today. Although we didn't mean to scare everybody, I think it probably does scare a lot of people. what's occurring today, because it is bad and it's getting worse.
Glad we could participate and help out there, David. And if anyone ever has questions, don't hesitate to reach out.
So John and Brett, we appreciate it. And with
you.
that, we will sign off and see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, David. We'll be back in touch with the overview document for the team. No problem.
Thank you.
Thanks all.